The US women's national team is one of the most successful football teams in history.
For the fourth time, the United States of America are crowned champions of the world, and for the very first time they've done it on European soil. It is finished at the Stade de Lyon in the final in victory and joy for the United States.
They are also in the unique situation of being one of the few sports franchises in which the women's team is more successful than the men's.
The whistle, it's done! It's over! It is over! Trinidad, with nothing to play for, has dethroned the United States, knocking them out of the World Cup 2018.
Unfortunately though, this hasn't been enough to convince the United States Soccer Federation that equality in payment should be guaranteed across both teams.
This shouldn't even be a topic of discussion, whether we should be making the same amount as men. We're putting in the same time, the same work, the same effort. We're making dramatically less money. That is an issue, that is a problem, and we're tired of it.
For over a year now, players on the US women's national team have been battling their federation in the law courts in a bid to reach parity with the men.
In March, the women's team sued the U.S. Soccer Federation for gender discrimination. The lawsuit claims the women were paid $1.7 million for winning the World Cup in 2015, while the men's national team was paid over $5 million for the 2014 World Cup.
In this episode, we explore the ins and outs of the US women's lawsuit against the USSF and ask, how will US soccer come back from this?
It's kind of crazy.
Kelsey Trainor is an entertainment lawyer and sports writer.
You've got this massive equal pay lawsuit, and you have U.S. soccer coming out with these insanely extreme arguments saying that women by birth are inferior and therefore they should be paid less. And so the fallout from that has led to Carlos's resignation and kind of a big change in this equal pay lawsuit.
In just about 3 months, the U.S. women's national soccer team is scheduled to defend its world championship when the Women's World Cup kicks off in France. But today, in a stunning move on International Women's Day, all 28 members of the team filed a gender discrimination lawsuit against the U.S. Soccer Federation.
Let's go back to the very beginning of this. It's 2019, it's International Women's Day, and members of the US women's national team are filing a lawsuit. Tell us a little bit about how this lawsuit came about.
Before they filed this lawsuit, the players had this ongoing battle. So in the United States, the first step that they had to take was to file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, called the EEOC, and it's a government agency. So they did that in 2016, accusing U.S. Soccer, the U.S. Soccer Federation, of wage discrimination. That was the first step. Things there did not go smoothly. They did get a new collective bargaining agreement in 2017, in which the players won the rights to their royalties, so they are able to receive money for selling things with their own image, name, and likeness on it. But at the end of the day, they still did not get the types of things that they were looking for in higher pay and equal conditions. And so that's how we got into the lawsuit and the filing of the lawsuit in 2019.
There's obviously a lot of complex legal posturing that underlies this whole issue. So I want to try and break it down as easily as possible. So let's split it into the constituent parts. On the one hand, the players claim that the Federation has violated the Equal Pay Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Can you explain what these two pieces of law are and what the contention is about them?
So they're actually very similar. The nuances between the two, so Title VII makes it unlawful to discriminate against an employee because of their sex. The Equal Pay Act is a little bit different in that it's focused on pay disparities, where Title VII is overall forms of discrimination. So they're nuanced in the language that is used in the law, but they are essentially the same thing. And in many cases, if you're bringing one claim for the Equal Pay Act, you're also going to bring a Title VII claim.
And then on the other hand, you've got the Federation arguing that the US women's national team and the US men's national team are two entirely different teams with two different collective bargaining agreements. What is the force of their argument?
Collective bargaining agreements are essentially contracts for a group of workers that are negotiated on behalf of those workers by a union. There's usually an extensive negotiation process between the union and the employer. In this case, the union would be the Players Association and the employer would be US Soccer. So their argument is actually that each team has their own collective bargaining agreement. And this is actually their best argument. They're saying that, listen, you have a union that represented you in negotiation. And at the end of the day, if you have an issue with anything that you've contracted for, take it up with your union.
So let's move forward to February the 20th of this year. On that day, the players of the US Women's National Team and the US Soccer Federation, the USSF, filed their respective motions for summary judgment. Can we just make a point of clarification about what the motion for a summary judgment is? What function does that perform?
So a motion for summary judgment is a fairly common legal practice. It's almost always filed after the discovery phase in a lawsuit. So it's after each side have exchanged back and forth all the information to put on a trial. But it happens before a trial, and it is used to decide issues of law. So if there are certain things that can meet this standard for summary judgment, a judge decides on them. So out of this case, a judge could decide that based on all the evidence that exists, there's so much that exists that they meet this standard that the judge could decide that there's been discrimination or that there's been a pay disparity. So it is this tool that's used to decide all or parts of the case prior to trial. An entire case can be dismissed or decided on summary judgment should the judge decide to do so. They're not often granted, but sometimes they are.
In total, they filed 144 documents, which make for around 1,000 pages of reading. What information did this documentation bring to light?
It was a lot of reading. And first and foremost, this is the first time that we've seen a number put to this case. So in their motion for summary judgment, the players attached an expert report where they are overall seeking about $67 million in damages. That includes back pay, it includes punitive damages, and more. So that was the first major thing we kind of saw out of these motions for summary judgment. The second thing is that we saw these arguments from US Soccer, which led to this eventual turmoil. So one of the arguments we saw was that each team has their own collective bargaining agreement that they've bargained for. And again, if you have issue with that, then you take that up with your union. They also argued that the pay structure between the women's national teams and the men's national team is different. The women have a fixed salary, whereas the men receive fees and performance bonuses if and when they play. But the major thing that did come out of this motion for summary judgment was the argument by US Soccer that essentially argued that women are inherently less skilled due to physical differences at birth, and therefore, because they are less skilled, they're not performing equal performance for equal pay under the law, and therefore they should be paid less. That's where this major argument came in, and they doubled down on this argument in their responses to these motions for summary judgment as well.
So you've mentioned that the monetary loss was cited by the US women's players. Can you talk us through that figure of $67 million?
That $67 million figure is based on experts that the players brought in. And that is the money that essentially that they would have been paid if they had been compensated similarly to the men under the men's collective bargaining agreement. The expert report in this case, I believe, was like 50 pages. And in it, they go through the standards of what the players would have earned. This is an economist who's doing this. It's important to note, so while the original lawsuit consisted of 28 players, at the end of 2010, the players were granted class certification. So U.S. women's national team players dating back to, as far as I believe it's June 2015, up to current players, their damages of back pay are calculated in this assessment. So as of the time of the filing, there was 38 players whose back pay was assessed under the men's national team figure, and more players will likely be added because not everybody had opted in yet at that point.
Can you talk us a little bit about how the collective bargaining agreement is so pivotal in this scenario?
In this case, US Soccer, their argument about the collective bargaining agreement and it being different between the men's and the women's team it was their best one. Still, the law does not allow for, if you have such a major discrimination based off of gender, even if you have a collective bargaining agreement, that defense doesn't hold up. If you're discriminating, whether you have a collective bargaining agreement and a union negotiated for you or not, if you're discriminating, then, it's against the law.
So in short, there's a dispute over how much money the US women's national team received in comparison to the men's team, and the argumentation falls around the notion of what equal pay must look like for different teams. For the US women, equality means that the two teams should be treated as a unit and they should be compared, and for the USSF, the existence of separate collective bargaining agreements, for them at least, proves that these two teams should be judged on their own merit. Is that right?
Yes.
This is where things get messy. As you've already mentioned, there's some language used in a motion released on March the 9th, which suggested that the ability level for the men's national team and the women's national team are fundamentally different. That the, quote, overall soccer playing ability, end quote, for the men's team is, quote, materially influenced by the level of certain physical attributes such as speed and strength required for the job, end quote. On top of this, players of the calibre of Carly Lloyd and Alex Morgan were asked fairly laughable questions about the comparisons between the men's and women's games. Can you talk us through this issue?
Yeah, so again, U.S. soccer just did not do themselves any favors. To argue that physical attributes between men and women that may or may not be inherent at birth, to argue that that is a reason for paying men more is literally the definition of discrimination, especially when you're talking about the skills required to succeed or to perform the job of a soccer player. You're saying that those are based on them. So the women's national team players are arguing, hey, are you not looking at skill, tact, intelligence, talent out in the field, and also, that little old thing that we do called winning that the men don't do? The United States men's national team does not win. How are we not performing the same amount of work that the men do? Men play against men, women play against women. So to argue that we are inferior when our results are superior, just, it's not a good look.
Obviously, there's some quite inflammatory language being used here, and we all know that the women's game has a hardcore group of fans, especially in the US, not least because, as you said, they're so successful. So what sort of response did this approach from the USSF get from the fans?
The fans were outraged, and I think in large part because it didn't just feel like the language was referring to soccer, right? I think women everywhere felt this, and if you look at so many different areas of work where women are paid less, I think it was a huge attack. Another thing that happened was all of these sponsors came out.
Another shakeup at the top of U.S. soccer. Any surprise that this announcement was made?
None whatsoever, Zubin, especially when you've got Volkswagen, Coke, and other sponsorships coming out immediately going right after U.S. Soccer and the Federation and Carlos Cordero.
You have Coke, Deloitte, Volkswagen, amongst a few of them, to basically say that these arguments are disgusting and unacceptable. So the fans kind of went crazy, the sponsors went crazy in return to that, and it just put huge pressure on U.S. soccer to act.
Carlos Cordero may have thought his resignation as U.S. soccer president would go largely unnoticed on a sports day like the one that we saw Thursday. Not so much. Not after 3 days. 3 days, his U.S. Soccer Federation filed legal papers in that gender discrimination suit, claiming women players had less physical ability and responsibility than men. He's now resigned.
And as if this wasn't enough already, there was also a letter released on the 8th of March, just before the She Believes Cup kicked off, from Carlos Cordero, who was then the president of the USSF, which claimed that US soccer had presented the players with a new contract structure, despite the fact that there was already a collective bargaining agreement between the federation and the women's national team. In particular, Cordero wrote, "We have offered to provide identical compensation to our women's and men's players for all matches controlled by US soccer." This claim was contested by the players, who produced a 6-point deconstruction of those claims, and subsequently Cordero has resigned. What happened there?
I mean, first of all, it was just a horrible move and incredibly tone deaf. They released that letter right before the She Believes Cup that happened on International Women's Day. That was the year anniversary of the filing of the lawsuit. And so to start with that letter, first of all, if they were in fact negotiating with the players at that time, he broke confidentiality by talking about it. Second, players came back and said, Yeah, great. So you offered us, in your mind, equal pay. No, you were offering us the equal pay of the men's 2011 rates, right? It's 2020 and the women are more successful than the men. So, they kind of came back to that saying this is a complete fabrication and disingenuous. After that, he issued an apology letter that was during the last She Believes Cup game in Houston, saying that they were bringing on new lawyers for the case and the arguments in those briefs weren't reflective of the views of U.S. soccer. Like I said before, oddly enough, those arguments still remain on the record in the case and have not been removed. After that, you had the players coming back saying, listen, we've always felt that there was this undertone within U.S. soccer, that maybe they viewed women as less than men. But to see it in writing at a time where, we're fighting for all of this, it really hurts. The players, they were fully hurt by it. That plus the pressure from sponsors led to Carlos's resignation.
So what do you think the immediate future of this dispute looks like? Is there any chance it can be resolved soon?
So a lot is up in the air due to the coronavirus. Many courts have actually postponed trials. Some courts are not accepting any legal filings that's in paper or electronic filings. So it is up in the air of when this will occur. As of right now, the trial is still scheduled for May 5th. I think that there is a stronger possibility that the case ends up settling. Now you have Cindy Parlow-Cone, a former U.S. women's national team player, is now the president, and she's at the helm of this. And I think given public opinion and the damage that they have done, the players are in a better place to settle the case. At the end of the day, I don't know if it goes to trial or not. I think at this point, a settlement is an appealing option.
How long-standing an issue is this issue on equal pay?
I mean, you can take this all the way back to, the famous 99ers. You've got Mia Hamm, Julie Foudy, Brandi Chastain. These issues of pay inequality and the men being able to earn a living playing soccer, but the women not being able to, were at issue before the 99 World Cup. They were fighting for a living wage and things like maternity leave. The men had these contracts and they had a league to play in, and the women did not. So it goes as far back as that, as the women fighting U.S. soccer for any semblance of compensation.
A good example of this is the 1999 World Cup winning side, who then went on to boycott the 2000 Olympics. Could you tell us a little bit about that story?
So they had won the World Cup, the 99ers did, and they kind of brought U.S. soccer to the forefront of many Americans' mind. And yet, at the end of the day, you had the soccer federations essentially saying that they were being greedy. They didn't deserve this level of pay. They didn't deserve these benefits. Certainly worldwide, soccer is more popular than in the U.S., but these players were saying, listen, you've seen the results of this 99 World Cup. We're bringing in sponsors. Mia Hamm was sponsored by every major brand at one point. And when you think of U.S. soccer, you think of that iconic image of Brandi Chastain in her sports bra after they won. So U.S. soccer thought they were being greedy. You had the players, Julie Foudy has said many times, like, listen, I don't know that we would have had the courage to file a lawsuit right before going in and playing a World Cup. But what they did instead was they protested the Olympics, and you had more junior players that were sent to play, and you had senior players who withheld themselves from the Olympics.
I've got a quote here from a Meg Linehan article that was recently released on The Athletic. She writes, "The Federation has been simmering in sexism for years. If Carlos Cordeiro resigns, that does not solve the larger institutional problem. It would merely remove one person who had a hand in the most recent decision-making process." How much do you think the history of the US women's national team has played into the current situation?
I think you're seeing it and you're hearing it from the players as well, that there is an ingrained mindset in U.S. soccer that essentially reeks of misogyny and sexism. And that's evident by the statements that they made in their legal filings. The players have always felt this, and kind of going off what Meg said, a new president doesn't change this overall culture at U.S. soccer. I do think it's a good next step. I think the fact that Cindy Parlow-Cone is a former player herself is helpful. It's not a full solution, but I think you have a bunch of things, the pressure from sponsors as well, being helpful into kind of changing this culture.
I think so many of the issues here feel as though they are structural, and I think these issues have emerged from the fact that what we have here is an oddity in which women's team is actually more successful than their male counterparts, which I don't think happens in many areas in football.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the U.S. women's national team is in this perfect combination. I mean, you have one where they are more successful than the men's team by many, many miles or kilometers. Two, you have these players who are incredibly successful themselves. They're a brand and they're not afraid to speak out. And then you have the laws in the United States, like the Equal Pay Act and Title VII, that are in their favor. And so I think when you have this combination of their success, right, they're also bringing in revenue, they're bringing in sponsorships, which is not something you might be able to say for other women's national teams across the world. It really is this perfect combination that this team particularly has.
So how do you think this issue will be resolved? Do you think it will result in a huge payout? Will the USSF be held to account?
I think it will be settled. There's so much at stake, and without these players, how else is U.S. soccer going to make money? The men's national team is not winning. They're not qualifying for things. They're not bringing in sponsors. And so I think it's actually bad business for U.S. soccer to not fully understand and realize how much money and how much of a value these players are, and that the U.S. women's national team is for the overall U.S. soccer brand. So I don't know that the figure will be this $67 million, but I do believe it will be a meaningful amount of money. And more importantly, I think going forward, there's going to be a big restructuring of the contracts and the pay structure.
The overriding question is, how does the USSF move on from here? How can they rebuild the trust of almost every facet of the US women's national team, from the fans, the players, the sponsors, and women themselves?
One, they need an overhaul, and two, they need a good PR agency. The damage that they've done to their reputation just will not be repaired overnight, even with, good faith. If they resolve things quickly now, I think that's helpful. The longer that they drag this out, it hurts them. They've essentially made statements that have insulted and offended women everywhere, not just these players, and really anybody who believes in equality. So I think the damage that they've done to themselves in the court of public opinion is significant, and it's going to take a lot of time to make that up.
Kelsey Trainor is an entertainment lawyer and sports writer. This episode was produced by Josh Schneiderweiler and Hugo Chambray. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoy this podcast, why not subscribe or review it on iTunes, or share an episode with a friend. See you next time.